Film Trace. This is a new podcast where we trace the life of a film from conception to production all the way to release and reception. Is an exploration of a new release film and what people are thinking about it. In our pilot episode, we have chosen the new Spike Lee film, The Five Bloods. Let's dive right into the conception of this film. Chris, you want to take it away?
Yeah, Dan. Let's start with where the idea for this film stemmed from. With a filmmaker like Spike Lee, it's always interesting to see where the seeds of his ideas begin, because unlike some other auteurs, he's very open about what he's trying to do. Obviously, the major criticism lodged against him is that he's didactic, he creates polemics, and that and that's, some see that as a weakness. But I think, as the New York Times said in their profile of him a few years ago, when Netflix released his 10-episode series adaptation of She's Gotta Have It, the culture is starting to catch up with him, right? He is a guy that maybe 10 years ago was out of what many saw as like out of touch, but with race being more in the forefront of American discourse, he's more needed, I think, in the landscape of film than ever before. And so where this movie began was actually, out of all places, originally a script by the writers of The Rocketeer. The little remembered, though I don't think it's little remembered.
No,
I just think it's
an age thing. I think if you're an elder millennial or older, like a Gen Xer, you're going to remember The Rocketeer. If you're under the age of 30, you have no idea what we're talking about. Exactly.
That's probably apt. Yeah. But yeah, it's such a time capsule of a movie. Was it centered on a World War I era like experiment?
I think it was World War II, but like pre-World War II. Yeah.
Okay.
It's a dude with a rocket on his back. It's a totally terrible film, but like very rememberable. Everybody remembers it who saw it as a kid.
I mean, I feel like our whole generation, we're kind of pretty dead center millennials, and it seems like the concept of a jetpack was like as futuristic. Crazy. Right, like that was like our version of the hoverboard of Back to the Future.
Flying cars, that's all the same
exactly.
Stuff.
So the two guys that wrote that movie wrote this script. What was it called? The Last Tour?
Yeah, The Last Tour. Yeah.
Last Tour. So these guys created the script, and then somehow I believe John Killick, the producer of Da 5 Bloods, as well as several other Spike Lee films, as well as another huge slate of films, both with big and small budgets, both successes and failures. He's kind of a Hollywood mainstay. He created everything from Free State of Jones to The Hunger Games. He got a hold of it, and then Spike Lee realized that he wanted to do a Vietnam movie. He had done World War II with the very probably one of the worst films of his career, Miracle of St. Anna, in 2008, and he wanted to follow that up with a Vietnam movie. And it makes sense because he's always talked very highly of a very particular brand of war film. He's always been a huge proponent of Francis Ford Coppola. They've been best buds, and it's clear that obviously the key influence in this movie is both Apocalypse Now as well as The Treasure of the Sierra Madre, which isn't so much a war film as much as a treasure hunt film, an adventure movie, and he is mashing them up, which is what Spike Lee is best known for, taking genres and mashing up just as much as he's known for his racial politics in his movies. So where did it go from there, Dan? How did this script get tangled up into a very turned from something that was very much a kind of generic war movie? Those guys, the Rocketeer guys, they also made like a 2013 straight to DVD movie with Tom Berenger or somebody, I forget who.
Oh, Sniper? No, not Sniper. But no, it's interesting too. A couple things that, in terms of how it was sort of kicked off, the original director attached to this was Oliver Stone.
That's right.
So they had shopped it to Oliver Stone. The producer did. And Oliver Stone, of course, made two of the classic Vietnam films, Platoon and Born on the 4th of July, which I both love. And I think he's wanted to go back for a third time here. But the film was centered around a white main cast, and then Oliver Stone essentially kind of ghosted the producer. And I believe the producer brought it to Spike Lee because one of Spike Lee's favorite films is The Treasure of Sierra Madre. And so I think they thought that he would really be into this. And what's interesting too about, you know, getting this made and everything, coming out of the Black Klansman, which was a commercial and critical success. Spike Lee did win the Oscar for adapted screenplay. I think his first win. He had a Lifetime Oscar a few years ago. This is his first sort of big win. Right. Coming off of that, you know, you would think that it would be easy to get this film made, right? Yeah. But he shopped it around to essentially every studio, and they all said no. And there was a great line in one of the interviews he was doing for this press tour for The Five Bloods that basically said, Netflix was my last stop. Like, there wasn't anywhere else to go with this film. And I find that really fascinating, because you would think someone like Spike Lee, and maybe this goes to what you're talking about in terms of kind of not being the man of the moment over the last 10 years or so, but Black Klansman sort of being a turning point for him in his career. But this was greenlit before Black Klansman. And so Netflix sort of, they really believed in what he was doing. And I believe the day after he got his Oscar, he flew out to Thailand to start filming this thing. And so I thought that was like, it just sort of, it's illuminating that someone with the stature of Spike Lee, you know, who has been a successful filmmaker for 30 years now, and with such stature, can't get a major studio to make a movie like this. And it kind of like goes back to like, you know, this podcast comes from the ashes of the Wild Lion podcast, which I've been doing for 4 years. And then you recently joined on to sort of to add some support to the podcast. And one of the things that we looked at a lot is that how movies are produced and created, and the money side of things. Do you think that the money wasn't actually there for this, to make a movie about, you know, African-American Vietnam vets going back? Do you think it would have been a box office success? Or do you think it, you know, every other studio was right in saying, let's pass on this, it's not going to do well? I mean, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm looking back at this, and he's had a pretty steady stream of movies with around $15 million budgets. Both Black Klansman and Chirac are reported to have $15 million budgets. They're his 2018 and 2015 projects in reverse succession. And before that, he made a very small film called The Sweet Blood of Jesus, a vampire horror movie that basically didn't make it anywhere for distribution. And Chirac only made $2.5 million. So it was a huge loss.
Yeah.
And if this is being greenlit before all the success of Black Klansman, then it kind of makes sense that people are looking at this as a money thing. But also, it is kind of unfair thinking about the way in which you have somebody who, while definitely reproved himself with the success, both, like you said, critically and financially, of Black Klansman, but it's not like his cultural cachet has like skyrocketed. It's just been refurbished, if you would, right? It's not like something. Exactly. It's not like he's a different Spike Lee than he was, before Black Klansman came out. I think it's a really nice way to, as Spike Lee probably would want to do, is give a middle finger to anybody who didn't believe in him, even though his filmography is admittedly scattershot. I think even the biggest Spike Lee proponents would agree that he's had his ups and downs throughout his career. He's been nothing if not eminently masterful and watchable in terms of the way in which he conducts himself on the film set and the way in which he gets people to care about what he's trying to talk about. Even though Chirac only made $2.5 million back in 2015, everybody was talking about it when it came out. Like, it's an incredibly shocking and controversial movie, and it's not a great movie, but it's still Spike Lee. Like, it's still you need to talk about it, you need to see it. So the fact that he couldn't get, and we have some kind of unreliable research about what the budget was for this movie, but the best thing that we can look at is that according to the Vulture behind the scenes rundown of The Five Bloods, it was probably somewhere in between 35 and 45 million, which is admittedly a heck of a lot more than any movie he's made, probably going back to 2013's Old Boy.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I love how they got that information, because like Netflix for some reason will not confirm production budgets, which is like something that like a normal studio would do. I'm not sure why Netflix is very secretive about viewership numbers and how much money they're spending on things. So in this case, they kind of played that card, but I love that they're like, it's between this movie and that movie. It was like Inside Man and Malcolm X, I think they said.
Right, yeah.
And so that kind of leads into the production of this film and sort of, shooting it over mostly in Thailand. And I guess the city shots were in Ho Chi Minh City in Vietnam, and sort of looking at it and maybe our initial reactions to the film, especially sort of the action part of the film, because there is a really strong action element. Almost it is, and I'm not a Spike Lee expert. I've seen maybe Inside Man, Do the Right Thing. That might be it. I've not seen Black Klansman. So
what?
I was I think initially, and this will be, a little bit more on the reception part of this, the genre mashup was very severe here. Looking at that production budget and how they shot it, and sort of, it was a tough shoot, it sounds like, with people fainting and stuff like that. They were in the jungle. You look at that production budget between 35 and 45, and from, doing the Wildline podcast, what that really means in terms of making a movie. Did you think it looked like that? Do you think it looked, well, first of all, did it look like a movie that cost that much? And two, did it look like a theatrical release that you would get from, say, Universal or Warner Brothers? Or do you feel like it was different?
Like you said, this is kind of bleeding over into the reception part of it, because I definitely think it depends on how you watch this movie.
Yeah, totally.
Especially how you take those war sequences. One of the most fascinating choices, I think, from a production standpoint, is that he made sure that the flashback scenes were all filmed on 16 millimeter, just like Coppola did for Apocalypse Now. And so it gave it a very, the aspect ratio is also more of a full screen, because I think he's been very clear in his press tour that he wants to remind everybody how much Vietnam was the televised war. And it makes sense then to choose that kind of awkward aspect ratio and that kind of grainy, kind of bled out colorization as well. And but then another part of the press tour that makes me think about what's going on through Spike's head during those action sequences, specifically the flashback ones, in which, yes, if I was going to take away all context, I would say that does not look like a $40 million set of action sequences. However, there's one or two quotes that really stand out to me from what he mentioned in the press tour that I think really only like super nerdy film people would get. And we should understand that Spike Lee, in addition to just being like an expert in filmmaking, he's also like one of the most well-read filmmakers. Like, he watches everything.
Yeah,
and
totally.
I really love that even though I totally felt jarred by the low budget-ishness of the action sequences, especially the first flashback. It makes more sense when you realize that he is purposely poking fun at a lot of the films that I think it's Isaiah Whitlock Jr.'s character makes fun of in that scene leading up to the flashback, where essentially you basically have the Rambos, the Missing in Actions, the Chuck Norris movies, where, a lot of what the masculinity of these Vietnam vet characters that they're kind of struggling with, even as they have this deep reverence and care for each other in the group, they are definitely having these memories, trying to traumatically struggle between viewing themselves as heroes and viewing themselves as cold-blooded killers. And so I think that if you look at it from that context, was Spike making a choice? Was he making a choice that was aided by the restrictions of his budget, or was it somewhere in between? I would argue, since Spike is very much a proponent of moral ambiguity in his movies, he's probably a proponent of leaving that open to interpretation for the viewer as well. And so while it definitely comes across as not really a theatrical release in terms of the quality of those action sequences, I think I want to say that he learned his lesson from Miracle at St. Anna, which I assume you haven't seen.
No, I've not.
Right? But that movie, he was definitely going for, it's right off the heels of Inside Man. And so he was going for like the Spielbergian like gloss of.
I do remember that from the trailer and stuff. It had that sheen to it.
I can Google the budget here, but it's very clear that he had all the money he wanted because Inside Man was such a huge success.
Yeah.
And Inside Man also was his way of showing everybody, like, fuck you, I can make a big budget genre movie. And so, like, with Da 5 Bloods, it's like he's trying to have his cake and eat it too. He wants to make a genre movie, but he also wants to say everything he has to say about race in America right now. And I think
absolutely. I mean, it's go ahead.
No, I just think that like that's a hard thing to hold in your head while you're watching those action sequences and trying to judge it based off of the quality, because it definitely seems kind of shoddy. But is that on purpose? I don't know. How did you take it?
I mean, it's tough, because if it was one thing that kept going through my head with the production of this is that, so he uses the multiple aspect ratios. I think someone said there's like 4 of them. There's 4 different aspect ratios, which I thought was interesting. But it kind of points to Spike really trying to cram in a lot here. And not only sort of the genre stuff, but I think the political messaging here is, I mean, it's so out. I mean, it's a political movie, right? I mean, you can't really view it in any other context. Sure, it's a movie about the Vietnam War. Sure, it's about brotherhood and about sacrifice and a little bit about Vietnam in general as a nation. But it's mostly about these men's experience and their political reality and lived life and that story. And as he tries to cram in more, he does use these different sort of techniques. What I found interesting is, you use the documentary sort of viewpoint early on and at the end of the film, or even shots of current day, like the Black Lives Matter scene at the end where they give the money, the $2 million check to them. Very different viewpoints.
Yep.
Right. He is. I don't know if this sort of goes along with what he's done before. I don't know. Maybe you can speak to Black Klansman. But I mean, totally different styles. And when somebody mentions something like the My Lai massacre, right? One of the Vietnamese sort of marauders mentions this, and he then cuts to different aspect ratio, almost like a filmed version of that actual footage. And it's very graphic. I mean, you're talking dead kids, dead women and children, like lying in mass graves. And then it cuts back to the scene that you're in. I just found I liked that a lot. I thought that was interesting, but you can make the argument that, like, is that too jarring? Does that take you away from the main narrative story? And these are very clear and confident production choices that he's making. And I think when you're talking about the flashbacks and stuff like that, I'll be honest, it didn't really bother me all that much how shoddy it looked. And it looked shoddy. Like, I watched it for a second time today, and I noticed, especially in that first action scene, there's 2 things that stood out to me. And the cinematographer on this, I forget who it was, but I know they're really good. What stood out to me is the shots of the actual helicopter as they're flying. And then the gunfire and the gun battles and the blood splatters, all CGI. And, if I saw this in the theater, I'd be like, but I think there's something to the way that he's crafting the story. And it's a non-traditional film, right? It's almost like a multimedia experience. That's almost like used as education to really root you in the context of the story that you're seeing. And it's not just the aspect ratio of the documentarian stuff. It's also the dialogue too, where he's very overt with exactly what he's trying to say. And as somebody who, loves subtle films and stuff like that, it is a little bit weird. But when you get to the end of it, I feel like, oh, this is really a journey that you're on. And it's because of that multiple perspective that he gives you through the production of the film and the different production techniques that he's using, that it really sort of paints this fuller picture. I don't know. Did you kind of feel the same way about that? The way he shot it and used the documentary stuff? Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I mean, if you check out Black Klansman, he did that to a minor degree. On the bookends of the film, the opening has to do with the connections between going all the way back to the Birth of a Nation movie, and so it's a little bit of a film history lesson, and connecting it to Trump, and then at the end of Black Klansman, no spoilers, but it does end up being a love letter to the protesters during Charlottesville, and there's intercut footage of David Duke and Heather Heyer, who was the victim of that murder by vehicular homicide.
Yeah.
So he kind of dabbled with that, and he did it in a very lesser degree in Chirac. So it's like he's been on this trajectory. So I have this theory, anyways, about, and I think if you look at Spike's career over the past couple decades, first off, have you seen 25th Hour?
I have. Movie? Yeah. I love that movie.
Yeah,
Absolutely
it's fantastic.
Yeah.
So there was this moment in the early 2000s, post 9/11, where I think more so than any other filmmaker, it's very clear. Like, he literally made a movie as a marker between his two kind of lives as a director. Basically, I think you could pinpoint everything pre 25th Hour and post 25th Hour. And there's, of course, aberrations in that. Like, She Hate Me in 2004 is a kind of throwaway Anthony Mackie romantic comedy that kind of links back to some of his 90s work, like Girl 6. But then you look at everything else after 25th Hour. You got Inside Man, his Fuck You to Hollywood, Miracle at Santa Ana, his attempt at doing, a classic war film, Red Hook Summer, he is, and The Sweet Blood of Jesus is him basically, those were his Kickstarter movies, him showing that he doesn't need Hollywood to create some interesting art. And then he remade the Japanese film Old Boy, in 2013, and it's a complete misfire. But he's trying to do something. It's not until really Chirac and then obviously Black Klansman. I think we are going to be seeing a very interesting few movies coming up after The Five Bloods with everything that's happened this year. A lot of his press tour, he's taken the time to talk about George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter protests and defund the police activism, and it'll be very interesting, especially because Black Klansman, the movie that got him back on the map, so to speak, was a cop movie. It was, very much a movie in which the protagonist was able to, like Spike is in To Five Bloods, like I mentioned earlier, have his cake and eat it too. He's able to both be a cop and also still be like a symbol of Black power. So it'll be very interesting, I think, to see, looking back at all of his career and how he's progressing as a movie maker. And you mentioned the cinematographer for To Five Bloods, Newton Thomas Siegel. I think I see people talking about this movie when referencing To Five Bloods' influence, but I don't think it's any more evident than it is that he picked the cinematographer. He usually works with Ernest Dickerson, who's amazing in his own right, but he picked Newton Thomas Siegel for this movie, I think, because he was the cinematographer for David O. Russell's The Three Kings back in 99.
Gotcha.
And that was exactly what Spike was trying to do, except from a very different angle and about a very different war. But essentially, it's a genre movie that also has a lot of things to say. It's like one of the most interesting anti-war movies, I think, of the end of the 20th century. And to make that oblique connection, like I just love the hard-headedness, the confidence of making a choice like that, because this guy's also made a bunch of crap. He's also shot everything from Pump Up the Volume back in the 80s to Valkyrie and Leap Year, and also made other really great movies like Drive. So like he is so committed to combining genre work with political work, and it's so exciting to watch. I wasn't bored for a second during Five Bloods.
No, I wasn't bored at all ever, and it's 2.5 hours long. I mean, this thing is not short. I will say this though, like I think in moments, there were moments, especially with Paul's character near the end, where he's sort of, and spoiler alert, if you haven't seen it, we're probably going to give a little bit away. He is having that sort of breakdown after he goes off on his own, where it is just some of just beautiful acting. I mean, just gorgeous. And I think that's a Spike Lee sort of trademark, that real close-up face-on view where you get the camera right up in the front. Yeah. And that was just wonderful. But then you kind of go back a little bit to other parts of the film. You're like, how does this all trace together? And it sort of does it trace together? It does, but it's pretty tenuous sometimes, because you're kind of, you're looking at that scene and that cinematography and the way that film looks, and it almost seems like there's a part of me that felt like if this was like a 5-part Chernobyl-like limited series, he could have done so much more, and that sort of jumping around tends to work a lot better in that format. Even if the time was essentially doubled for the content. And so I thought that was a little bit sort of jarring with that. And I wonder if Spike Lee is going to go the route of Terrence Malick and sort of just start spitting out films left and right. I hope not, because I don't think Terrence Malick has made a good film since The New World. But that's only my viewpoint. Let's dive into what people are thinking about this. So it premiered Friday, June 12th, this last Friday on Netflix. I believe this is his first Netflix movie, right?
Yes, if you don't count the 10-part series adaptation of She's Gotta Have It from 2017.
Gotcha. But he also did Chirac was Amazon. I think Amazon
Correct.
films? Okay,
yes.
good. But it also played in theaters. So this was supposed to be released in theaters.
Exactly. Yeah.
And I believe it was supposed to premiere at the Cannes Film Festival, where he was going to be one of the head judges. I think he's going to get
the first black head juror.
Oh yeah, and I think that's going to get pushed out to next year now. And so I think on the initial release, when you're looking at the critical stuff as it was coming in, very, very positive across the board. So right now it sits at 92% on Rotten Tomatoes, 81 on Metacritic, which is very high. Anything in the 80s on Metacritic is really good.
Yeah.
We don't have any of the traditional cinema score tools or anything like that because it wasn't released in theaters. On Letterboxd, 3.8 out of 5, which is very good. And then some random stuff, like Reddit. I looked at our movies has a discussion board. It's not scientific or anything like that. But it's just your average Reddit user, who goes on that board, film nerds, 7 out of 10 on there. Mm-hmm. And then the audience score is a 63% on Rotten Tomatoes. Again, that's not verified audience score, but it's just a general survey of people who've seen the film.
Including people that probably, watched it for 10, 20 minutes on Netflix and then decided it wasn't for them. Yeah.
Yeah. So what do you make of these critical responses? I mean, I think it's pretty much universal, maybe not universal praise, but high praise pretty much across the board with some few pretty loud detractors, I would say. How do you make this?
Well, I mean, I think that a lot of choices that Spike made for BlacKkKlansman, which for comparison's sake got a 96% on Rotten Tomatoes, he was really trying to kind of hone in and focus. And for this movie, which understandably, I mean, you do not have kind of the mental trauma breakdown, like borderline, I'm not a psychologist, but borderline schizophrenia, especially with Paul's character that happens towards the end of the film. Yeah. I definitely think he was trying to match that with his visceral visual style. And I also think that he's probably, there's a lot more anger in this movie, I think, than there was in BlacKkKlansman. And there was a lot of anger in BlacKkKlansman. And so I think that that automatically is going to turn people off. And like you said, kind of the tangentialness of some of the plot threads, in which he was, once again, trying to have his cake and eat it too by going off on those kind of Looney Tunes moments. Like, the one thing that stood out for me, like, so I don't come across as a total fanboy, is I really do think that the French people, the Lamb group that is trying to search for mines, that definitely felt kind of out of nowhere, especially like the romantic tension between Jonathan Majors' character and the lead
Hetty
woman. That was a little ridiculous. Though I will say Jonathan Majors' performance was almost just as good as Delroy Lindo's. He's so amazing. Good. I love him. But I do think that because of that kind of effusiveness, that disparateness of To Five Bloods, it makes sense that it's a little lower rated. But I will say, I think if To Five Bloods came out before BlacKkKlansman, it wouldn't be nearly as universally praised. I think it definitely, he's on the upswing. There's a huge discussion going on in the world right now that makes To Five Bloods vital watching. And so I think it's interesting that, like, a movie that like Chirac, which is definitely not as good, but definitely has a lot of things to say about race and gang violence and misogyny, and it did not get the universal acclaim because it's coming off the heels of Oldboy, which was a complete misfire. So it's interesting to see how he's been well buoyed by the success of BlacKkKlansman.
Yeah, and it's sort of, in terms of its success on Netflix, I checked today, it's number one, right? It's the number one piece of entertainment. That's all movies, all TV. And I checked on Friday, and I didn't really see it in the top 10. I think it's just taken a day or two to people sort of, maybe that, I don't know how they compute that, but maybe it takes 24 hours or something. But yeah, I think yesterday you have it listed, it was third. So it's doing quite well. And what just with general audiences, what I found interesting too with the sort of the critical response, and I'd read a ton of Rotten Tomato reviews and Reddit reviews of it, is that to me there seems to be this pretty wide distinction between the two viewpoints of, yes, this is a good film and I didn't really like it that much, I don't think it's good. And that distinction is between, do you buy into the political and historical context of what he's trying to say? Mm-hmm, and if you buy into that and you see that and you feel it, you're gonna let all of the sort of weird plot juxtapositions. The script isn't super strong. Like you said, there's a whole swath of characters that don't matter. There's a lot of tricks that he pulls out from a plot perspective that don't necessarily work. But if you viewed it without the historical, political, social context, especially right here now in the United States, I could see those being detractors enough to say, hey, that wasn't really good. But with the critics and the viewers who say, hey, this is an important film because it talks about an experience of a group of people that does not get talked about hardly at all, especially uniquely to the African-American soldiers that served in Vietnam that came back to a country and a world that didn't sort of respect them at all. There's so much there. And he also weaves in all of the Vietnamese issues that are part of that as well, about the global war on communism and why were they even there in the first place. And there's a really good exchange right when they're about to go off into the jungle, where their guide Vin talks about how Ho Chi Minh is their Uncle George, and how, like Ho Chi Minh, who's, in America up until probably about 10 years ago, completely vilified as this communist whatever who took over Vietnam, right? As an evil sort of villain, but to them he was a freedom fighter. And to those 5 soldiers, Malcolm X was a freedom fighter. And so, like, there's all these different perspectives that I think what he does so well, what Spike Lee does so well, is he gives you this total view that it's not a polemic at the end of the day. It feels like a polemic, but a polemic is usually one-sided, one perspective beats you over the head. And I didn't feel that here at all. This felt almost like a chorus of different viewpoints.
I mean, we didn't even mention the fact that the default protagonist is a Trump voter and wears a MAGA hat.
Of course, yeah. I mean, there's so many different layers to it, and I feel like, but I will say this about the reception of it. If you asked me, hey, is this a good film? Like, technically written, all that sort of stuff, I'd be like, it's okay. But is it an important piece of art? I would say absolutely yes. And if, like, does that distinction make sense to you? Yes and no. I think that ultimately at the end of the day here, and I know we got to wrap this up, but I think that Spike Lee is a uniquely singular filmmaker that in most other cases you can more easily make that distinction that you say between, good and important. But I think that the way that Lee has always worked, going all the way back to Do the Right Thing, which is still, his unheralded masterpiece, by and large, everybody agrees. It still seems like it doesn't ultimately matter, right? Like small things that would annoy me, like the group of 3 mine detectors. The Frenchmen.
Yeah, exactly. Like that would bother me way more if it in a other film, because it was not. You have so much other, like the canvas is so huge, right? Yeah, and it's so, like you said, overstuffed, and yet Spike uses that brimming to the top and overflowing in such a watchable way that you can't get mad at it. I'm going to be haunted for days about many different points in this movie, and ultimately that completely negates any minor criticisms I have about the plot straying or the script being kind of loose and shaggy. It just doesn't matter, because it's Spike Lee. He gets to do that. Let him do it. Who cares?
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah. It's like there's a certain point in an artist's career where that confidence and that clout really hits a point where someone can do a movie like Da 5 Bloods. Where if someone's a 40-year-old filmmaker, they don't have that yet. Right. And he could just go for it and feel good doing it. And I think the end results sort of speak for themselves, because it is an important film that people should see. And I think that's kind of the conclusion, right? It's important art that people should definitely check out. That's it for our first episode of Film Trace. We're going to be back next week. We're going to talk about what? The Darkness, a 2016 American supernatural horror film with Kevin Bacon that you probably don't remember, but it's coming out on what? Netflix?
Yeah, it's coming out on Netflix this week, finally. It was very little seen in theaters and is the worst reviewed Blumhouse movie. And we're both Blumhouse fans here at Film Trace, so it'll be interesting to trace how you ended up with such a dud in an otherwise seemingly very competent production studio.
Awesome. Thanks for listening. We'll be back next week.